Hello, everyone. My name is Keenan Cameron, and today I will be doing my book project on Race Matters. Race Matters by Dr. Cornel West. I really enjoyed reading this book. It was a wonderful read, a great read. I'm so embarrassed because I actually have a signed copy of this book. It was on my bookshelf actually for quite some time. I actually had the opportunity to hear Dr. Cornel West and Dr. Maya Angelou speak at Georgia Southern in about 2009, 2010 when they came to do a research symposium. It was extremely fun, and I'm so embarrassed that I've had this book for quite some time and haven't had the chance to read it. But that's neither here nor there because I have read it and I have enjoyed it. So, without further ado, let's get started. Let's see. So, let's talk about the title, Race Matters. Race Matters, right? So, matters function as a noun and a verb, right? So, noun matters is an affair or a situation under consideration, right? Race is the matter. Race is the situation under consideration that we're talking about. It's a topic of discussion. It also functions as a verb. Verb matter, excuse me. To be is an infinitive. So to be of importance. Race is the matter of importance. It has significance. That is the topic of discussion, right? The topic, which is the noun, and the significance is the matter. Who is Dr. Cornel West? He's a professor, philosopher, author, activist, right? He was born June 2nd, 1953. So he had a birthday just a little over a month ago. Tulsa, Oklahoma. He's professor at Harvard University, and he's a former professor emeritus at Princeton University. He focuses on the role of race, gender, and class in American society. So for the purpose of my book project and, and the curriculum philosophies that we've been studying, I would classify him as a social reconstructionist. He uses race, class, gender, and all these things such as poverty to call attention to the things that we need to fix in American society, more or less. He's written over 20 books, edited over 13 of those books. He's best known for, his classic Race Matters, 1993 or 94. First African American to receive his doctorates from in philosophy from Princeton University, where he's professor emeritus there. So that's interesting. We aren't too far removed from 1980. So that just shows a lot. And Dr. West actually supported Bernie Sanders in the last two presidential campaigns. So that also says a lot too about, what he believes about his curriculum philosophy and the course and course of action in which he think America should go, right? So that's Dr. Cornel West. He begins talking about his biweekly trip to New York with his wife, and how he stood on the corner waiting for a taxi for quite some time, for over an hour, had his hand raised, and it was a problem. He even talked about how there was a Caucasian woman who came shortly after him, on to flag down a taxi, and she was able to get a taxi and he was still standing there, and they both shook their head at each other, and she said, "This is ridiculous," right? He talks about the verdict of Rodney King at the start of the novel, Race Matters. The verdict, and how no one's talking about it anymore. But I also thought about of Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Mike Brown. No one's talking about it anymore. The gentleman who actually, who allegedly murdered Trayvon Martin is walking free. He's actually he's gotten all types of endorsements, believe it or not, for his actions. So he says that we need to have candid and critical conversations about race. No one's confronting it head on. We need to hold people accountable. African Americans need to hold people accountable. Like, there's no reason why Clarence Thomas, should have been appointed and confirmed in the Senate, when George Bush did that. He talks about 86% of white suburbia still live with less than 1% of Black America. So he said, what can be done? What is the problem? What can be done? The major tragedy of Black America is the past decade or so is the low quality of Black leadership, the relative inattention to the deep crisis of Black youth. And he says, to put it bluntly, we simply do not have enough Black leaders who love and respect Black people enough to tell the truth and trust them with the truth. Not only tell them the truth, but trust them with the truth. Now, he do hold these to be valuable. He says that we should admit that valuable source of hope help empower within ourselves, within African Americans, in our common history. He said that we should focus our attention on the common good that drive national global destinies, right? The quality of life for everybody. Ensure that everyone has access to basic social goods. Everyone has access to housing, basic food, healthcare, education. All of those things are important, and we need to meet the needs to generate new leadership. We need new leadership in Black America at this time. We don't have the same leaders of Zora Neale Hurston and Martin Luther King and the John F. Kennedys, and even though he was white, but he was still a leader nonetheless. But we don't have those leaders. We don't have the Black leaders that we need in the society today. He talks about nihilism in Black America as the rejection of religious and moral principles. He says that the enemy of Black America's survival has been and neither the oppression nor the exploitation, but the threat that loss of hope, the absence of meaning, right? The lack of self-love directly related to oppression. We African Americans have a hunger for identity. They have been stripped of our identity for Africa. And then they come to America and say, well, they don't have any identity here. So what is their self-worth? He's always said that African Americans have been in the wilderness searching for the promised land, right? So when he talks about the pitfall of racial reasoning, he says the failure of nerve already manifesting. Selection and confirmation of Clarence Thomas. He should have never. There should have been the Black leaders of the time should have spoke up and said that this is not the African American who will represent us in the Supreme Court. He says that those leaders at the time used racial reasoning. Well, it's Black. He's Black. It's about time that we have someone, of color representing the people on the Supreme Court. He said we should erase this sort of reasoning, the racial reasoning, and use moral reasoning. Black leaders need to adopt prophetic framework and moral reasoning. He says where there is no vision, the people perish. Where there's no framework of moral reason, what is right, all that is fair and that is right, the people close ranks and war against all. So we should talk about, what is fair versus what's just racial, but what is moralistic, what is ethical, what is right. In the crisis of Black leadership and the new Black conservatism. He says how do we account for not having the Frederick Douglasses, the Sojourner Truths, the Martin Luther King Jr.'s, the Malcolm X, the Fannie Lou Hames, the W.E.B. Where are they? He said the 1960s, that was the time of the thriving Black middle class. That's the unprecedented economic boom. At that time, he says Black parents, they no longer sent their kids to Morehouse and the Howards and the Fisk and the Hamptons. They then sent their children to the Yales and the Harvards and the Princetons. And that's ironic because he's a graduate of Princeton as well. So Cornell goes on to say, Dr. West, goes on to say that without a vibrant tradition passed on to the new generations of today, so those Martin Luther Kings, those W.E.B. Du Bois, those Anna Coopers, they need to pass on that on to today, right? The past leaders, they were fueled by their anger of the state of Black people, the state of Black America as a whole. Like that fueled their anger. He says people are not angry enough now. They stopped talking about the Sandra Blands and they stopped talking about the Rodney Kings. They're not angry enough. He says what we need, you can classify the three Black leaders in three groups: race effacing managerial leaders, race identifying protest leaders, or race transcending prophetic leaders. He says we have to candidly confront the existence head on. So when we talk about new Black conservatism, it's the response to the crisis of liberalism in African Americans. He says Black conservatives believe that Black liberals adhere to victim status. He says their personal failings, they blame their personal failings on white racism. He says they harbor debilitating loyalty to race that blinds them from the aspects of Black behavior and what they are doing wrong. He says Black conservatives, they mock affirmative action despite having benefited from them. New Black conservatives are generally first generation middle class people, right? So they're first generation Black middle class people, right? So, and he said that's because the structural transformation of the U.S. economy. Black conservatives thought that Black liberals, they didn't address the decline of the industrial jobs, which is a major source of Black employment. Over 40% of Black Americans worked in the industrial jobs at the times of the 1960s. So And the black conservatives believe that, these liberals, the black liberals, they did not address the, the declining jobs with the influx of technology and the declining of the industrial jobs. Even nowadays, present day, a lot of black Americans work in the factories. They work in the industrial factories that of America, make most of their money on overtime. He says that black conservatives believe that the viewpoints of the liberals at the time were outdated, misguided, and outdated, right? Um, so he talks, but beyond affirmative action, he says the fundamental crisis in Black America: too much poverty, too little self love. The distribution of wealth is not even, right. 95%, 1%, the top 1% of America, they own more than a 95% of the bottom, right. So he says that we have to urge for a class-based affirmative action. But he does note that without affirmative action, black access will be more difficult, even if it does fail to reduce black poverty. But he did note that that's not the only important thing that we need, but it does help to redistribute wealth inside of Black America. Um, Dr. Cornel West, he covers a lot. He covers black sexualism. He covers the Jewish Black America and Jewish relations. He covers a great deal in the Race Matters. I thoroughly enjoyed the book. I align with a lot of things, but I'm not as radical as as Dr. Cornel West. Um, but I would classify him as a social reconstructivist. He takes all, he uses all of the like I said, the poverty and the things that are going on that plague African American community, and he calls attention to it to help us fix African American society, or aim to fix African American society. Dr. Cornel West.